Good afternoon, everyone. We want to thank you for joining us. I'm joined by two of my favorite colleagues here in North Carolina, Dr. AJ Jager and Dr. Lawrence Rouse. My name is Mike Kraus. I work at the John M. Belk Endowment, and over the next few minutes, we're going to share our story of how we've been focusing on adult learners within the community college sector here in North Carolina over the last few years. We'll talk about how we got here, why adult learners have become such a focus in our state. We'll talk about some very specific campus strategies with Dr. Rouse, and then we'll wrap up by talking about what we've learned. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Next slide. So as we began examining how each of our campuses are suited or not suited to serve adult learners, two things are apparent. One, the work that Achieving the Dream does is so well suited to this work. Because as y'all know, so much of ATD's work is about taking a really close look at processes and systems and that stop our students from succeeding. And I think what is evident is that many of our processes and systems in higher education and at community colleges, unfortunately, are built for the student that you see on the left side of this screen. And this is the stereotypical 1940s undergraduate student who is attending college and they have their sweater on and they're walking through the quad. And the reality is that this student doesn't really exist anymore. Don't get me wrong, within some of our universities, certainly you see this very traditional pipeline of students. But the reality is most of our systems, even though our student population has changed, our systems haven't. We are still starting generally at 16-week semesters and taking long breaks and having class attendance policies that are murky and sometimes having faculty that approach their role in higher education to try to be as difficult as possible to ensure only the best make it. And all of those systems are systems that I think ATD and of course you all as ATD network schools have really taken a hard look at the last few years, but nowhere is it more apparent that we need to look at these systems than when you look at who students actually are right now. The two students in the middle are adult learners that I was fortunate to work with directly when I was in Tennessee previously, both working moms, both of whom needed to see student advisors, not from 8 to 4:30, but at 5:30 when they got off of work and picked up their kids. The adult learner on the right is an example of a growing population of all of our campuses of student veterans. The good news is one of the biggest questions about higher education is answered for them. How are you going to pay for it? Because the GI Bill is there. The bad news is the systems of higher education are exquisitely not fitted to a 25-year-old freshman. And I know that because the student in that far right of the picture is me. And I was an adult learner. And I didn't go to college right after high school. And I started my journey at a community college. And I hope that I bring all of those experiences to the work that AJ and Dr. Rouse and our colleagues are doing to just remind ourselves that we have to change logistics of college as much as we have to sit around and talk about the academics of college. Next slide. I promise that I'm not bringing these data points to serve as a doomsayer, but these are the data points. And when I say that the traditional student pipeline has changed forever, that's because of math. Some really radical things have happened across our demographics since 2007 and 2008 during the recession. As a result, the birth rate is very obviously headed in that direction, which means that the 18-year-old cohort class that would have entered in fall of 2025 traditionally from high schools is not coming. There will be a class, certainly, but it will be dramatically smaller than any freshman class that we've seen in recent years. And so that's headwind number one. There are just fewer traditional students. Next slide. Headwind number two, or challenge number two, is that as everybody knows here, higher education, I would say in the mid 2000s, we all began thinking about attainment goals. We began thinking about workforce goals. To be clear, community colleges have been thinking about workforce goals forever. But the rest of higher education decided to catch up to community college and say, how are we going to fill our workforce needs? Mathematically, and I use North Carolina as the example just because it's where we're situated, we can't reach the number of graduates we need to fill open jobs with just traditional students. Again, not mathematically possible. We could have literally every single traditional aged 18-year-old high school graduate go directly to college in North Carolina, graduate, right? 100% enrollment, 100% graduation rate, and we still won't reach our workforce goals. The last reason why we're focused on adult learners, and particularly what I'll talk to you about around NC Reconnect, isn't given to a data point, though I think there's probably data points that illustrate it, because the third reason that we think this is important is a very human reason, which is to say a lot of Americans are struggling right now. That if your life was difficult before the pandemic, it didn't get easier, it got harder. And we, and I can only speak for myself, Dr. Jager and Dr. Rouse, but I believe many of our colleagues across the state believe that higher education is the fundamental vehicle to transform people's lives. And if you are an adult who is struggling to find their way in the workforce, our community colleges are absolute miracles in these students' lives. And they take people into a fundamentally different reality for their family, for their children, and all of the generational impacts therein. That's the real reason that we're engaged in this, but the data illustrates that we need to be as well. Next slide. So we started, in fact, on the campus of Dr. Rouse's campus, Pitt Community College, about 2.5 years ago now. And we started, remember, 2.5 years ago, the pandemic's very fresh. In fact, at our first meeting, we were socially distanced and we were all wearing masks. But we did begin wrestling with the questions that I think we all started to wrestle with during the pandemic, which is how do we best serve adult learners, and also having the courage to admit that however we were serving adult learners wasn't the right way at that moment, that we needed some radical transformations. And so these were 3 guiding questions. I worry sometimes that when people tell colleges serve adult learners, it's a lot like telling someone run a marathon. There are a lot of scaffolded steps under serving adult learners and reaching adult learners. So one of the things we did, and I think has served us well during this specific initiative, is we started with the adults we knew. And those were adults who had attended but hadn't completed. And hopefully all of their contact information was inside our various student information systems. So this notion of saying help adult learners instantly becomes a little more honed to say, find the adult learners who have been on campus but didn't succeed, because we know how to find them, and let's reach out to them. And then that is the segue to reach out to them with what message? I think we have found during the course of the last 2.5 years that even those that said, hey, we are adult learner friendly, right? We are all in on this. When they took a step back, found the vestiges of that student and that fraternity sweater within their own messaging. And we were reaching out to adult learners with view books of a quad in the fall and students studying on the grass. And our adult learners said, I will never do that. I will go to class, leave, pick up my kids, try to do homework that night, and then I'm going to go to work the next day. So even some of our messaging wasn't really aligned to what adult learners need. And most importantly, we had failed to account, and I mean me, I will own this, in my past roles, had sometimes failed to account that just encouraging someone to go to college, if they have already been to college but didn't succeed, that message is not effective, because it's saying, hey, buy our product again that you bought once and didn't work for you. And so instead, we began to ask, what's the message that changes this paradigm? And I will relieve some of the suspense to say, ultimately, that message became about getting a job. And do you need to go to Dr. Rouse's college to get the skill to get the job? Absolutely. But we began with the end in mind of get a better job, get a better skill. Finally, and this is sometimes what I think has been maybe the most impactful part of this initiative, is our colleges in North Carolina do a really good job at finding common ground. We're fortunate. We have 58 community colleges spread across the state, as we call them, the Great 58. These colleges are complementary. No college is exactly the same. Everybody has a different community they're serving, many different types of degrees they're offering, and very rarely do these colleges find themselves in competition. So what would happen if we built a cohort of colleges that we're all learning together. And when Dr. Rouse finds something that works at his college, are we then able to deploy that strategy learned in Greenville, North Carolina, in Asheville, North Carolina? And the answer for us has been yes, and we think it's been really impactful. Next slide. So demystifying the exact initiative that was hatched in Dr. Rouse's meeting room that day is really about 4 components, and I've alluded to these. First, if you are an NC Reconnect college, the John M. Belk Endowment supports Inside Track to then grab your students who have not completed and reach back out to them. Say, hey, come back. Here's what your opportunities could be. I will tell you bottom line up front, outreach that works right now in 2023 is about one thing and one thing only, and that's texting. So if you're an NC Reconnect school, the first step is that data audit. Hello? Who is enrolled but not completed, and the files run through the clearinghouse, it's cleaned up, and then Inside Track begins essentially acting on the campus's behalf as an outreach arm. Because the reality is, if you walked into any IR office or admissions or enrollment management office of any community college in America and said, hey, I just need you to call these 2,000 students real quick. Actually, I need you to text them 3 times each. That would not be a realistic or kind ask. And so we hope that we build capacity for NC Reconnect schools with this tool. We'll talk in a moment about what the results of that outreach has been. Second, we don't take for granted in this initiative that those in the local area were fully aware of the opportunities that were on campus. And so one thing I want to point out here is this is distinct from that outreach to adult learner stop outs. This is a different block. This is saying maybe the adult that's never attended Pitt Community College, that we reach out to them. And here we do find digital marketing to be the primary channel. And yes, we use that message that didn't even have the word college in it. The message that we tested with focus groups and have now deployed across 2 cohorts was better skills, better jobs, Pitt Community College. And we can talk in a moment about the ad treatments that have been most effective. 3, we recognize, again, going to a community college and saying serve adult learners is profoundly unhelpful because every community college in America is serving adult learners. But could we go to a Dr. Rouse and say, hey, what do you need to serve adult learners in an enhanced way? And as a philanthropy, our ethic is first, do no harm. And so we offered each of these colleges funding support to do essentially whatever they needed to do on adult learners. And we'll talk about how they use that funding later. And then finally, if you become an NC Reconnect school, you have joined a network. And we've learned from greats like Achieving the Dream about what a network can look like. What can it look like to have a president in a room with a bunch of other presidents able to just talk and be honest and transparent and learn from each other? What does it look like if we do the same for our marketing pros, our financial aid professionals, et cetera? Next slide. Those that aren't familiar with North Carolina, I'll just say we have a little bit of everything. We have as rural a community as there is in America. And we also have 2 of America's fastest growing metro areas. And we've also got the ocean. And we have everything in between. I would have been very wary of an initiative that focused in only one geographical pocket in our state, because the reality is a lot of our colleges, they have some things in common, but telling Caldwell Community College solely launching an initiative in the mountainous area of North Carolina is completely different than launching an initiative in the Sandhills area. And so from day one, with each cohort, and we're now 3 cohorts in, one of the #1 things that we've worked with Dr. Jager and her team on is ensuring that every cohort spans west to east. Next slide. Okay, so what happened? Across 2 cohorts, we had a master stop out file of 23,477 adult learners. So in the aggregate, we went to Inside Track with a file of 23,000, almost 24,000, and said, please start outreaching these adult learners. I would have been very happy with these cold calls yielding a 10% contact rate because they're cold calls. The contact rate across both cohorts is 30%. So 1 in 3 were responding to that text. And the numbers that I assure you, Dr. Jager, and we ran them as recently as Tuesday again, because we can't quite believe that this is where we've landed. But if you got in contact with Inside Track and were actively coached, 21% of those students went to college. They enrolled. They took the affirmative step and enrolled. And we're really happy with that. I think it shows a couple things. One, I think it does show that this kind of multi-pronged strategy works, but I think it really shows something I'll talk about again in a moment, which is adults want to go back to college, especially if you've gone and you didn't succeed, which was my story. I did not succeed in college, and then I found myself in the Army. In my case, the military gave me a lot of time to think about doing things that weren't the military. And I spent a lot of time thinking about getting back to school. I think what we tapped into with NC Reconnect with adult learners is they did want to go back, but they had never been contacted in a tailored way. And they had never been outreached with a message that was compelling enough to say, I'm going to try to fit college into the complex jigsaw puzzle that is my life. Next slide. As I just stated a moment ago, adults want to come back. We just have to make it work for them. And by the way, that does not mean rebuilding your campus from the ground up, right? It means, as you'll hear from Dr. Rouse, probably just some tweaks operationally throughout the continuum. And it means faculty and staff on the campus having that awareness that, hey, we're going to perhaps be dealing with a different type of student with a different set of needs. The second point will be Dr. Jager's to make long form, but I will just tell you all, I wouldn't want to have done this initiative without the Belk Center at North Carolina State that AJ leads, because there's the story that the spreadsheet tells, which is a powerful story, but then there's the really deep story you only get when the student level data is handed over empirically to a research center. And that is the role that Dr. Jager and her team play. And what they found out that could be, across my career, one of the most compelling findings is that if we could get at-risk adult learners to the 4-week mark, they made it. In fact, they made it at a higher rate than their majority peers in some cases. So it was really about the first 4 weeks. There are a ton of stories to be teased out of that, and Dr. Jager would be unhappy with me if I tried to infer all of those stories, but one could say it does indicate that the front end logistics really matter, and that the 3rd week of hazard is not equal to the 12th week. Finally, personalized outreach. I know every college likely has the emails that go out and the cards that go out. And I think those definitely have their spot. I think it's different, and our campaign has demonstrated that it is different when the text comes that says, Mike, this is Rob from Pitt Community College. We'd love to talk to you about coming back. And that personalized outreach feels like one of the special components. And we have heard from adult learners, it really mattered when somebody reached out to me on text or phone call to me, not with a shotgun blast, to say, hey, have you thought about coming back? Here's what it would look like. Really quickly, I want to highlight 4 campuses that we've worked with and what has unfolded there that are probably most exciting. And by the way, as the chats are dropping in, we will answer all of these questions at the end. So please continue to pose questions. And as we can, we'll answer those in the chat. So I love this picture. In the right moment, this picture will get me emotional. This is not stock photography. This is Forsyth Technical Community College. That's a mother and a father. The mother's registering for college with her son there watching. We could go into many levels about why that's touching, but I think it's an incredible depiction that our students, our adult learners, are likely coming to campus with a different set of life circumstances than a traditional student. I want to emphasize something I haven't done, and I try very consciously not to do, which is when I say adult learner, I am not necessarily talking about a 35-year-old. I may be talking about an 18-year-old that has a child and can file a FAFSA independently. And that's been very important for us. In fact, in the last cohort, and in a state with as much military as we have, there are a wide range of 22-year-old adult learners in North Carolina who have just gotten out of the Marine Corps from Camp Lejeune. So we're very careful to not attach age to adult learners, but instead make that FAFSA filing status. Because I think there's probably a whole lot of 18 or 19-year-olds that we would love to bring onto campus with their children. and serve them as adult learners. So this picture was taken at Forsyth, and at the 12-week mark last fall, they reached out and said, hey, I just want you to know that 13 of our cohort, by the way, that's 10% of their cohort. They had 130 reconnectors. 13 of their cohort graduated in 12 weeks. I got really excited. Their president had an interesting take, Dr. Janet Spriggs. She said, that makes me sad because that means that's how close they were. And they had left. And we're really glad they came back. But she focused on the fact we had lost them that close to the end. And I thought that was a really interesting insight. Central Carolina Community College in Sanford, North Carolina. One of my favorite parts about the work with these adult learners is it doesn't lend itself to your admissions staff typical rhythms, right? It just doesn't. Because unlike traditional students, we don't have that captive audience sitting in a high school from 8 to 5. And so Central Carolina Community College, when we went to their first Reconnect meeting, the most vocal person in the room, I initially thought was their vice president of enrollment management. That was not. That was their local bishop, Bishop Millett, who doesn't even work for the college. He just believed that for his flock, the most important thing that could happen to improve their lives was to go to Central Carolina Community College. And I think it just is a depiction that we'll probably have to use different channels to reach out to adult learners than we've ever used before. Fayetteville Technical Community College, near and dear to my heart, as it's located at Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, North Carolina. I have heard my entire career, and in fact, have been worried myself about hand-wringing around SAP. And frankly, I've been in conversations where SAP is almost presented as game, set, match. Well, they're out of SAP. They can't get Pell. You know, what are you going to do? Fayetteville Technical Community College actually said, no, we're finding these students didn't leave SAP with a 1.1. Most students leave SAP with a 1.8 or a 1.9, right? Which means one class gets them back. And so Fayetteville said, we're going to scholarship them in. And in fact, we're going to look in our student information system explicitly for adult learners that left because they lost their SAP. And we're going to make them an offer. And I just thought that was a really incredible example of thinking outside the box. And then finally, the best possible segue to Dr. Rouse. One of the things that Pitt Community College has become is a destination across the state for other community colleges who are now coming to Pitt to see what you'll hear Dr. Rouse talk about, which is when an 18-year-old traditional student comes on campus, we're very used to saying, okay, you're going to go over to Jaeger Hall and you're going to register. And then I need you to go over to Rouse Hall. That's the bursar's office. And then after that, meet back here and we'll talk about getting your parking pass. And Dr. Rouse and his team realized we might get these adults for 30 minutes in the evening. It has to happen in one location. And by the way, it has to happen probably at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. And obviously that poses a lot of challenges to any campus. But I think what you hear from Dr. Rouse is the results from that sort of thinking have been pretty powerful. And ultimately, what I think we've seen across our NC Reconnect colleges is that the things a president cares about get done. And across our 15 colleges, without question, the most important factor in executing this strategy has been leadership buy-in. And presidents who have been willing 100% to make decisions that weren't easy or self-evident, but then coach their teams into the why this is important. Cohort 3, I'll leave you with this, is in the field as we speak. So for this fall, that's when our third cohort of adult learners will start under this program. We put up a marketing campaign 15 days ago. And in that 15-day time, we're reaching out, by the way, to a universe of about 1,600 adult learners in this cohort. And in 15 days, we've had 300 adults reach back out and say, I want to go back. And that has surpassed even last year's cohort and the cohort before that. I think it indicates that while we know from a policy standpoint, the time for adult learners is now, there's something happening in our communities where people feel like they want to go back and they do want to change what they can bring to the workforce and ultimately what they can bring home to their families. And so with that, I will defer to Dr. Rouse to share the campus perspective.
All right, thank you, Mike. Certainly appreciate the comments that you've made. But I also want to say thank you to the Belk Endowment for the help and also for your personal investment at Pitt Community College. Also want to thank AJ and the Belk Center for what you've done, but also ATD. We also were an ATD college that looked at the equity lens of serving our students. So ATD certainly has had an impact on us and helping us to look at what we need to do to assist our students. What you're looking at on this first slide is our adult education, our GED students. And you'll see the young lady up front with the white blouse, pink slacks on. She's 84 years old and decided that she wanted to come back and get her GED. So if that's not a poster child for adults, I don't know what is. Next slide. So a little bit about Pitt Community College. We're the 7th largest community college out of the 58 within the system. We're located in Eastern North Carolina, and Pitt County is our service area. We have one county service area. However, we draw students from all over Eastern North Carolina because of our mixture of programs that we have here. One of our largest programs is our nursing, our health science, in which we have about 20 different majors in that here at the college. Out of our 98 majors, 20 of them are in the health science. The industrial business base of Eastern North Carolina and Greenville is biopharma, heavy and advanced manufacturing, and we have a large hospital system. It's actually the 33rd largest hospital system in the nation, which employ a lot of individuals, again, from the health science area. We have Pitt County Schools, East Carolina University, and the Brody School of Medicine are also our educational partners. We all work together to really try to ensure that we are training the workforce, that we're educating individuals for a better life. Next slide. So we wanted to answer the question of why adult learners. And I'm going to go through this fairly quick, but the first thing was we attended a President's Academy back in March of 2020, and all of you know that shortly after that, we were sequestered into our homes and we could not be on our campuses. But we were there in March and we defined a problem in our service area. And what we found out using the Belk Center, and the Belk Center convened us, the data from Carolina Demography, that we found out that there were 39,756 or 22% of our population were partway home students, ages 18 to 44. They had some education, but did not complete a post-secondary credential. And of course, that did concern us quite a bit, that folks had started somewhere but had not completed. And at that time, we also had a 24% poverty rate. So our we saw sort of a correlation between the individuals who had not completed their post-secondary credentials with our poverty rate, which we wanted to impact our social and economic mobility of this population. Next slide. So in June through August, we developed an adult learner action team consisting of admissions, financial aid, our deans, faculty, to support adult learners. We also did what we call the PCC Complete program to connect with adult learners who from 2015 to 2020 stopped out of PCC and had balances that prevented re-enrollment, and we provided funds to help pay off some of their previous debts. We designed specialized, customized in-house mailings for sending out to those adult learners with phone follow-up from designated staff. This was all in-house. But in April of 2021, we joined forces with the John M. Belk Endowment. And I remember that day like it was yesterday. We had Mike Krause, I believe AJ, you were there as well as Cecilia Holden, MC Belk, Pylon, and others were in the room. And Mike asked a question: are you treating your adult learners any different from those out of high school? And the room went silent for a moment, and one of my VPs answered, Dr. Tom Gould, said no. And that kind of struck us as that tipping point that said, no, we were not treating our adult learners any different from someone just coming out of high school. And after looking at our ATD experience, we know that we were treating everybody the same. Whereas ATD is about equity, which says that you need to look at what that individual student needs and provide that for them. So it was very telling that we need to do something different for our adult learners. And as Mike said earlier, all community colleges, we all serve adult learners, but this was a different way of serving those adult learners, because now we could focus on what do adult learners need. So we joined NC Reconnect with Blue Ridge Community College, Durham Tech, Fayetteville, and Vance Granville. And we developed, as Mike said earlier, a network, and we could all, talk about different ideas and so forth. And we also decided that fall to have the Better Skills, Better Job Fair for our adult learners, that they could come. And it became one of the biggest job fairs that we have in Eastern North Carolina. But probably the best thing that came out of this is that we decided to establish the Adult Learning Center here at Pitt Community College. And this was to customize and personalize the adult learning experience. Next slide, excuse me. So in realizing that adult learners had different needs, we decided that there were some services that we needed to offer to them. And part of this was really looking at an intake form that we developed to ask those adult learners, what are your needs? And these were some of the responses that we got. Assistance with transportation, childcare funding, career planning. They want to know what careers were out there, academic advising. Some even needed food assistance, some needed clothing assistance, mental health counseling. Remember, we just came through a pandemic, and the mental health of many individuals were really, really suffering. Also, they needed financial counseling, as well as how do you get financial aid to go to school. And also, a lot of them talked about job placement. Next slide. So also, I talked about Achieving the Dream. These are some of the partnerships that we had with various organizations. Achieving the Dream, we know that they work with leaders to transform colleges to ensure all students can access learning that propels them into rewarding careers. And we also look at that through an equity lens, as I mentioned before. The Belk Center for Community College Leadership and Research, which we're delighted to have AJ Yeager as the director. And that is supporting advanced community colleges across North Carolina. My Future NC, which set a goal by 2030 that we will have 2 million North Carolinians with high quality credentials or a post-secondary degree. Next slide, please. Also, the John M. Belk Endowment, which focused on improving post-secondary education. They developed the NC Reconnect with cohorts of community colleges. And those cohorts, as I mentioned before, became a network for each other. Inside Track, an industry-leading nonprofit coaching and higher ed consulting organization, which assisted with the outreach to those adult learners. And Vision Point Marketing, which is built to serve institutions of higher ed. So I mentioned all of these partnerships to say that Pitt Community College probably could not do this alone. And actually, we did attempt back in 2020 to do a little bit of this work, but calling in these professionals and having this partnership with these various organizations certainly propelled us quite a bit and helped us to develop the idea behind the Adult Learning Center. Next slide. So when we look at our strategies to recruit and retain adult learners and what do we find out about that, we had 646 individuals to come through our Adult Learning Center. And through their intake forms, we found out that 189 out of the 646 wanted academic support in math, reading, and writing. 167 wanted to know more about taking online hybrid classes. A lot of these had not been in school for a while, so this was kind of a new format for them to face coming back to school. 228 want to know about paying for their education and course materials. So it shows that the financial side of it was very important to them. Also, choosing a major. Time management was very high as well, 142 reporting that they needed more information on time management and test taking. Accessibility services for individuals who may have disabilities. Minority male. Food assistance, there were 30 individuals who did on the intake form indicate they needed assistance with food, counseling services, and again, financial aid, financial literacy counseling, 192. So again, another large number. First generation college students, 54. And then there were a group that said they didn't need any assistance with any of those above. So we had quite a lot of responses that talked about the services and that they needed to be successful here at Pitt Community College. Next slide. So in looking back at our Adult Learning Center for fall of 2022, we served 287 students, unduplicated head count. Females were 167, males 120. We had about a 50-50 split between our full and part-time. But what amazed us is that we retained 72.5% of those who came through the center, which for us is amazing to be able to retain that high number, and knowing that this population has certain barriers to higher education. So a 72.5% retention rate has certainly helped us to realize that this is working. And we're going to do more data dives later on. Next slide. So we'll have questions, I'm sure, in the chat box. So whenever, if you need to contact, I do have my contact information here, or you can put it in the chat and I'll be glad to respond to it.
Thank you, Lawrence.
AJ, thank you.
Such a privilege to work with Mike and the John M. Belk Endowment on this effort. And I'm always inspired when I hear the great works at Pitt to support adult learners under Lawrence's leadership. And as Mike said, I'm AJ Jager, the Executive Director of the Belk Center at NC State. And one of our goals is to create actionable insights from data to support our community college leaders. So this afternoon, I want to share with you some of those insights, as well as some outcome data for particular our cohort 2 colleges that are wrapping up some of their big initiatives this year. So each fall, a new cohort, as Mike said, of colleges joins the NC Reconnect team and collaboration, and the Belk Center works with those colleges to gather data, talking about what decisions leaders made to elevate this work. As Dr. Rouse has shared, what are their specific strategies they're lifting up around their student support staff. One of your questions was around what happens in the classroom. So talking to faculty about what they are or aren't doing or could or prepared to do. And then of course, talking to the adult learners themselves. And so over the past 2.5 years, we've engaged 135 individuals, as well as looked at specific quantitative data about persistence, retention, and completion. So through those interviews in this process, we've culminated the information to map the adult learner journey and to identify these 5 critical decision points. As a result of engaging with the team, these map to the student's journey, and I want to briefly talk about each of them, and you will see how well they coordinate with the things that Mike and Lawrence said about what we've been learning. So they're public messaging, partnerships, processes, pathways, and proximity. And I have a QR code that I'll provide later that goes into a lot of detail about each of these, but just want to summarize, and you'll see the great connections to what my colleagues have been talking about. So that public messaging, this focuses on those intentional communications that are happening to recruit adult learners. We know that there's just so much information, quick, constant information that is coming at all of us. And we've learned that those messages to adults need to be very direct, very specific in terms of career, and also solution oriented, that there is support for, Lawrence mentioned waiving some of the debt, that there is support to get back to college through childcare and transportation and food assistance. So there are some critical questions that colleges were asking themselves about what kind of communication processes they had for marketing to adult learners. How could those be improved? And how are we thinking? Where were our adult learners viewing those messages? How were they getting those messages? In addition to public messaging, we talked a lot about partnerships. Lawrence listed those partners in this process. Who are the individuals, organization, our communities that can help us better serve our adult learners? And partnerships are not new to community colleges. In fact, I think they would be the models we put up for in terms of the most intentional partnerships through our post-secondary organizations. But we're the new partners, social service agencies, churches, other local industry that could help support adult learners. And colleges were identifying who are their community champions that will help them support adult learners through the process. But it's not sufficient to collaborate just outside an institution. It was really thinking about the messages inside the institution. How would we get buy-in from our faculty and our staff across various departments, across offices, and sharing that we were very laser focused on adult learners at these colleges. So colleges were asking, what are the innovative partnerships we could bring to the table, and how will we foster an internal teamwork to get that buy-in to do that laser focus work around adult learners? Both Mike and Lawrence mentioned those processes. We think we design processes that make sense, but they make sense to us, right? We don't always know whether they make sense to the students we serve, and that one size fits all processes likely doesn't fit our adult learners. I've personally said that, when I try on hats, I'm always reminded that one size will never fit this head. And so they should say one size fits some. But would we ever say that to our students? Yeah, our processes are going to fit some of you, but not all of you. So it was colleges really rethinking all of the things that they do to serve their adult learners. Shifts and overhauls in processes to re-engage those students that have been left out or feeling left out. We also talked a lot about and heard from our colleges about pathways. And so many of you might be pathway colleges and had conversations about guided pathways and those supports to provide students to stay on the pathway. And when you think about that language, it's about being on a path and staying on a path. And that assumes that those paths are linear, whereas all our adult learners were about stepping off a path and having on-ramps and off-ramps that really recognize their complex lives. And so much so that they would understand that they're bringing prior knowledge, prior learning to the table, and that the on-ramp or an off-ramp wasn't a detour, but was in fact the right path for them. So colleges are asking really critical questions about academic advising and career advising, understanding and appreciating that adults have a different path. And finally, there was this idea of proximity that came up again and again when we were engaging with colleges. And when we think of proximity, we think what comes to mind is distance and space. How close am I to something, or how far away am I from something? And our adult learners talked about this. How close or far away am I from a class, from a classroom, from the college? Because transportation was a critical issue for our adult learners. And so when they think about proximity and distance, it was how easy is it for me to get back to class if I have a transportation issue? But it wasn't just proximity in terms of distance, but proximity in terms of time. How much time will it take me to finish? How far away am I from my degree? How many more credits? How much time am I going to need to take to re-enroll? How much time away from the re-enrollment period? So proximity of time was really important to our adult learners. And finally, there was this proximity to support, proximity to people, to relationships, to the people who would help support their education, who would help them navigate this process of returning to college. So adult learners were making decisions about proximity in terms of the distance, in terms of time, and in terms of people. And we could hear colleges making decisions based on how do we address those proximity issues for our students. So this 5 Ps that we're talking about helps frame some of this work that's happening across North Carolina. And we also developed a worksheet. So if you're at an institution who is just starting to think about this, or perhaps needs a refresher, we also have a worksheet that you can walk through to ask you and your colleagues some of these questions. Maybe you've been thinking about that and likely have, but need some time. As Mike said, bringing the cohort together for presidents to ask presidents questions, but taking the time at your institution to have some of these conversations. And these QR codes will lead you directly to that worksheet if you'd like to use that at your institution, and to our guidebook. And as I know that they're putting those links in the chat as well. But let's spend a little time about outcomes, because who doesn't love some fabulous outcomes? So thinking about the last 5 colleges that were through the full year of process. So Lawrence and his team was in cohort 1. We have a cohort 2 group of colleges. Wilkes, Central Carolina, Caldwell, Lenoir, and Forsyth are those 5 colleges of cohort 2. And Mike talked about the inside track outreach, and Lawrence also mentioned that 9,065 individuals in the fall semester were reached through the inside track organization. And most of these individuals had about 50% of their credits completed, but they didn't have a credential and a degree, similar to what Lawrence called our partway home students. And there was a successful connection made to almost 3,000 individuals. And this is critically important when we think about our adult learner lives, because they're not linear, they're not always in a nice, neat fashion. Just because someone doesn't want to return the day they're connected doesn't mean they can't do it in a year from now. Or just because someone's given the opportunity today doesn't mean that it actually fits their schedule. It could in a semester or 2 semesters or 3 semesters. So the idea of an institution having a connection again to almost 3,000 of their former students is a success as we move into the future. But 15% of them actually registered and re-enrolled, so 436 students. And I made reference to those 436 students as being larger than my hometown in North Dakota. It's not a small number. It's a large number of individuals who had decided we're not going back to college, who had decided we're not re-enrolling. So being able to say 436 students came back to our institutions is incredible. And also to say that 34% of those students were students of color, which is actually a higher average than the number of students at North Carolina Community College as a whole. So our colleges were putting a lot of effort into getting adults back, in particular adults from diverse populations. So let me share a little bit more, as Mike alluded to this, the danger zone of the first 4 weeks. We had 397 students still registered at week 4. And that time period, that month into college is so important. And literature says that if you're going to develop a sense of belonging, a connection to the institution, it needs to happen within those first 4 weeks, or life challenges, all of those other circumstances that encourage students to rethink if this was the right decision for them become more important than the connection to the college. And so in our first group, Mike mentioned that students of color were more likely to drop out in the first 4 weeks. But if colleges were able to commit them, connect them, and keep them past the first 4 weeks, they were more likely to stay as compared to their counterparts. And this was the same result in cohort 2, so that our students of color were most at risk to drop out within the first 4 weeks. The systems didn't match their needs. But if we could keep them, if we could provide the supports, the navigators, the proximity, to the institution to them, they were more likely to stay than their counterparts. So that first 4 weeks, we're going to talk about over and over again because it's so important. But if you look at the results of our colleges in those first 4 weeks, 91% of those students were able to be retained. Our colleges are figuring out, what do we need to do to be able to keep them? But of course, no employer ever says, I want to hire someone who's finished the first 4 weeks of college. So we also have to think about keeping students to completion. And that's 90% of the students who enrolled at NC Reconnect in the cohort 2 actually persisted and received grades. So that's, in this case, 436 students that enrolled, 22 completed their credential at the end of the semester. Those students were so close to finishing their credential, their degree, but dropped out. And through NC Reconnect, they're not only back, they've actually received that credential. 66%, I'm throwing lots of numbers at you, but this is the best, and I saved the best for last. Of those students who re-enrolled, they're still either in college, so they came back for the spring semester, or have completed their degree. So 66% of those students are still on a pathway or already finished that pathway and have achieved a credential. I'll give one example of an institution that had some significant success in cohort 2, and that's Forsyth Technical Community College. So this spring semester graduation, which was yesterday, 26 students crossed the stage that are part of NC Reconnect. And that is phenomenal. This actually isn't one of those students, but this student is someone I want to watch all the time. Look how excited. These are students who dropped out. This is the ultimate outcome. They're walking across the stage. They're on their way to a better job that aligns with a better future and a better life. A QR code to our guidebook, which shares much about cohort 1's experiences and will soon be updated to talk about cohort 2. And now we're going to turn it over to you all from some of your questions. And early on, we had a couple questions, and I'll summarize, Mike and Lawrence, if either of you want to take them. In those first 4 weeks, thinking about that, what does it look like in the classroom for those first 4 weeks? And Lawrence, you might be able to talk about what are you doing in those first 4 weeks in the classroom? And then another individual asked about connecting to advisors. So what's that advising happening differently in the, not just the first 4 weeks, but for NC Reconnect students?
Okay, well, one of the things that starts probably before they enter is that we are deliberate about really working with those students to get them prepared for the classroom experience. But we're also reaching out to the faculty members to say that this is an individual who is coming back to school after being out for a while, and they may need some additional supports. And also we have the academic advisor who works with these students, as well as success navigators. So they have a lot of support around them to hopefully, if they have any issues, and again, we still have the Adult Learning Center that they can always come back to and talk with them about any issues that they may have. So it's all about giving those supports and letting them know that if they need to reach out to someone. And I think that's what happens sometimes with individuals leaving an institution, is they don't feel that they're connected to anyone there. So they just kind of walk away. But if you got someone that they feel they can talk to develop that relationship, which that's what we're trying to do, is develop a relationship that they can, reach out to. And again, we're there to also let them know that things don't have to end their education. It may seem like an insurmountable. If you have a flat tire in your car and you can't afford a new tire, then let's find a way to get you a new tire. And we do that here at our campus, whether it's going through the foundation with emergency funds. If you're having issues with your with academics, we have tutoring that's available, but we want to make sure that you are aware when you walk in the door that these things are available. But sometimes the adult learner may have a little fear because they may have not had a good experience previously. So what we're trying to do is change that experience for them so that they're positive, that they've got somebody that they can reach out to. So that's one of the things I think that helps them to persist past the first 4 weeks. But we want to get them up front before they even get in the classroom. If you have issues, here's who you need to reach out to. And we also have counselors that check in on them as well.
I think as a campus thinks about how they serve adult learners, I have been shocked by how rarely we just ask adult learners what they need. And we had a convening recently that both Dr. Jager and Dr. Rouse were at. And y'all know during convenings, you can always use the measure of cell phones and screens, like who's paying attention? Are we just checking our email in another room, which is normally what convenings are these days. And the show-stopping moment was when we just brought up 2 adult learners. Hey, tell us your story. What was hard for you? By the way, one of those adult learners, LaShawna Harden, spoke with great courage with her president sitting at the table in front of her about, well, a lot of the logistics didn't make sense and everything closed at 4:30. And I can't come talk to advisors at 4:15 because I'm at work. I just would throw that out there as a starting point to get to how to fix the first 4 weeks is to just grab a focus group of adult learners. Lenore Community College out in Kinston, North Carolina, said, hey, adult learners, $10 Starbucks gift cards. It was a $50 investment on the part of the college to get 5 adult learners to sit there and just test thinking and have a conversation that I think probably gets you where Dr. Rouse and his team are. But to hear it firsthand from your students could be really powerful.
Let me ask you a question. How long does it take for them to be confident enough that they can trust you for them to open up about what their real needs are?
Who wants to take that one?
That depends on the individual as well. So our staff in the Adult Learning Center are trained to work with adults. And so they know the questions to ask and also to gain some, confidence there. We understand that a lot of times adults may be fearful of coming back into the academic environment because they're thinking that, oh, there's a younger students, I didn't do well the first time, or I may not, hate to hear this, but I may not be as smart as them, not realizing that they bring a lot of experiences that will certainly add to the academic experience of our students. So the counselors that you first encounter are there to really talk with you and to listen. And as Mike mentioned, we also try to assess what are some of the barriers that you have, which we mentioned in intake form. So we sit down with that adult learner and say, let's talk about what some of the barriers are that maybe you may be facing coming into school. And that way we can be kind of proactive. But you're exactly right. It does take a little bit of time before you gain the confidence. And I think you heard during my remarks that you have to build a relationship. They're not going to open up to you just by you saying, hey, I'm Counselor Rouse, and you need to tell me all that's going on in your life. It takes building that relationship, checking in on them, making those calls. And that's exactly why we put together Adult Learning Center, so that we could basically wrap our arms around them and say, this is a safe space. Please reach out to us. We're here for you. And we're here after 5 o'clock. And sometimes we're there before 7:30 in the morning because, maybe the only time you can come is before you go into work, or it may be a weekend that you can come in. So all of those things, I think, count and help them for you to gain their confidence. And the more success they have in dealing with you, I think the more they will trust you as well.
I think we're at time. Erica, were you coming back on? We probably
Yes.
all
Yeah.
afternoon, but no,
Yeah.
you all have other places to go.
Yes, we're at time. Thank you very much. We will have the PowerPoint presentation, and we'll share that out after the summit. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. This was a great session.
Yeah. Fantastic.